Right, good evening everybody, and welcome to the final, the Cambridge IV for 2016. The judging panel for tonight's final is as follows. In the chair, Beyonda Merkins. With them will be Daniel Bramble, Stephen Rajanavathan, James Dixon, Mohammed Asadullah Khan, Elliot Pallett, and N. Sing Lee. This evening, in opening government, we have Oxford B. In opening opposition, Hart House A. In closing proposition, UT Mara A. And finally, in closing opposition, IIUM. Speeches, as ever, will be of 7 minutes length, with the first and the last minutes protected. These will be signified by a bang from the judges, with a double bang signifying that 7 minutes is up. Without further ado, on the motion that this House prefers a world in which Islam is structured around a strong, central governing authority, such as the Pope in Catholicism, I call upon the Prime Minister.
When Islam doesn't have a strong central authority that can dictate what does and does not count as Islam, the narrative of who counts as Muslim, the narrative of what counts as Islam, is co-opted by the most violent, the most extreme, and the most conservative people within that religion. This is because those are the voices which are heard most loudly, and they drown out the more moderate, mainstream voices within Islam. 2 points in this speech. First of all, why it is we reduce Islamic extremism, because we can now have somebody who represents authoritatively the mainstream Muslim view that violent extremism is not Islam. Secondly, we reduce Islamophobia on the basis that, again, bigots and Islamophobes cannot say that true Islam is violent and horrible when the strong central figure says that that is not Islam. Before I get onto those 2 points, let's be clear about what we're talking about here. This Muslim Pope is going to have massive influence. Firstly, they will either speak for God, they'll speak for God directly, either as being infallible or as the best possible interpreter. Secondly, just as with the Pope, they will be respected as such throughout the Muslim world. Thirdly, they will have a massive distribution network of mosques for disseminating information. All Muslims will, via this network, know what they mean and what they believe. Fourthly, they'll be seen by the global media as the spokesperson for Islam. And fifthly, they'll be in charge of governing doctrine, not a state. Okay, so on our first point, how it is that we can reduce extremism from opening government. Yes?
Yeah, so who gets to determine that? Is it perhaps Sunni Muslims or Shia Muslims?
Oh, yeah, so good question. So it would be really nice from opening up to fiat out the Sunni-Shia divide. We're not going to do that. It's a little unfair. We imagine it'll be a bit like the Church of England and like Catholicism, in which you've got a pope, you have an archbishop, maybe there'll be representatives like that. The same internal mechanisms for selecting them as in those two organizations will be broadly the same.
Yeah.
Okay, so one, why it is that we reduce extremism. This is important because now we uniquely can target the people who are wooed by the most extreme and conservative form of Islam. At the moment, radical preachers can find disaffected young men and tell them that Islam teaches them that the correct way to behave is through being violent. They say we can give you meaning in your lives by giving up your life for Allah. The problem here is that there is no generally recognized authority who can say anything otherwise. The hate preachers fill that vacuum. They can say that this is true Islam. Yes?
Why is it like
Okay, so significantly, mainstream Islam is not violent. It's not one which believes in terrorism and suicide bombing. That is a very niche view. You can choose almost any mainstream Muslim leader. You're not going to get one that says, let's blow up the Twin Towers. That is an important benefit that we'll get on our side. So the important thing is that on our side, there is that authority. Notice, as I just said, that mainstream Islam is completely against terror. It abhors civilian deaths. It has a strong tradition of just war ethics. On their side of the house, you can have 100 imams issuing a fatwa against terrorism and nobody listens because the radical preachers can always say they do not truly represent Islam. On our side of the house, when you have somebody who seems virtually infallible, the equivalent of the Pope, that claim is not credible. It means that you have this mainstream Muslim Pope, not words I ever thought I'd say, is going to be saying that terror is not okay. What is the effect of this? Fewer people will be radicalized as a result. Why? Firstly, it suddenly problematizes the idea that you will guarantee paradise through suicide bombing or dying in battle. To the extent that these people are rational and they trade off the costs and benefits of committing these kinds of attacks, they will suddenly say, if I'm going to spend eternity in damnation for this, they might think twice. Secondly, lots of these young men seek belonging as part of a broader project. They think that they are fulfilling Allah's word. It's about a historical moment. It's about being part of this broader project. When you have, credibly, the mainstream of that project saying, this is not part of our project, this is not what God says, it's not part of our will, it means that that attractiveness is diminished. No, thank you. And thirdly, it can also stop radicalization in its earliest stages. See, notice that most of these young men don't start off just violent and suddenly then Islam fills the gap, but rather they start off being groomed, often online over a prolonged process. They start off moderate and things are drip fed to them about how they should commit these atrocities. The problem here is that on our side of the house, you won't listen to people who've been essentially excommunicated by your Muslim Pope. It means that these people don't speak for that religion, so the moderates at the beginning, or at least the people who are not violent, don't start on that path of radicalization. This is how we get fewer people joining violent Islam. No, thank you. But secondly, we get less Islamophobia and hatred on our side of the house. At the moment, Islamophobes and bigots see what these violents of pseudo or not really Muslims are doing and saying and then tarnish all Muslims with the same brush. They end up saying abhorrent things like we should shut down all Muslims coming into the US because they can tarnish them with that same brush. At the moment, the way that liberals and moderates and the rest of Islam tries to tackle it is by saying, oh, they're not real Muslims. Look, we've got loads of imams who've signed this letter saying they're not real Muslims. The problem is that the response from most of the public is to say, look, those people are the exception. These are some very nice imams that you've managed to find. But if you look at the text, it seems to say that you need to be violent. That looks authoritative. And look at these people who are being violent. This must be what true Islam is. On our side of the house, when you now have the Muslim Pope saying, this is not Islam, then it means that Islam is not that thing. See, everyone recognizes the Pope as being the spokesperson for Catholicism. Isn't it impossible to claim that Catholicism is something which the Pope says it's not? It's just not a credible claim. So here, when you have the Muslim Pope saying that this is not Islam, it becomes very, very difficult to claim that true Islam is what mainstream, recognized, respected mainstream Islam says it is not. What are the particular impacts of that? First of all, you get lots of violent policies against Muslims in the status quo which can come from dehumanizing Muslims and saying they are all in some sense essentially violent. It's things like drone attacks or invasions where we say this is okay because of their beliefs in some sense they are not human or they deserve it. This discourse ends. Secondly, you get much fewer violent attacks like you get against refugees in Germany. Again, because the people who are being violent cannot be coded or easily symbolized within social discourse as being Muslims. They have to be something other than that. And thirdly, you get far fewer policies that are oppressive against Muslims in particular, like Trump saying he's going to surveil all Muslims. It's not credible because it is not Muslims that are causing the problem anymore. You cannot believe that it is Islam that's causing that problem. It is instead minority radical groups. So because we can divorce Islam from the most extreme elements of it, proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and I now call on the leader of the opposition.
Honorable Speaker, panel, to the extent that people already disagree whether the Pope has legitimate authority, to the extent that opening government even characterizes this as likely to be the sort of movement that fragments and potentially has two verifiable leaders that claim to be heads of the most major sects, and that sort of division is normal in a religion of these sizes and these scales, I actually think that they advocate away a lot of the solvency of having someone who can be a spokesperson or an advocate for your people and eliminate the harms that come from outsiders supposedly or truly misinterpreting doctrine. But the second important thing to note about what you get out of that PM speech is that they are unable to define, one, how this person verifies their authority in the eyes of the people of their own faith, but secondly, the linchpin of their idea when they implicitly say that this person is likely to justify themselves to the public on the basis of the text is that this person will be someone who hews to a conservative, literalist interpretation of Islam that does no service to people who have attempted to modernize, incorporate new things, or reinterpret Islam in a way that is meaningful to them. Aislyn and I think we are going to take on the burden in this round of talking about an Islam that is relevant to more than an outsider who carries out drone strikes. It is also a religion for people who practice that religion, who work in that religion, and who reform its doctrines. So 3 pieces of refutation before our constructive case. The first thing that they tell you on government is that no figure exists to oppose this idea that is uniform enough that outsiders are able to point to them as like the authoritative figure on why Islamist extremism is bad. So 2 responses to this. The first is I am unaware of any mechanism they give you on government side of the house as to why for people who are willing to believe that Islam is a violent religion, that this is the tipping point for them, that having one guy stand up and say, no, no, guys, not so, that for those people who already have that type of hatred in their heart, I'm not sure why one person claiming authority is the real difference. But secondly, and I think much more effectively, to the extent that preaching hate has been successful, and this is the bulk of their constructive material, is that like the worst things that have come are hate preachers who didn't have an authority to stand them down. I actually think those people have been very successful in opposing the communally derived authorities like local imams who do oppose those doctrines. To the extent that they reject what authority structures were communally derived or more locally present, I'm not sure why they would follow an authority figure who is further away and suddenly stop preaching hate. I don't think that they've effectively proved that to you. So secondly, on Islamophobia then, if the people who are Islamophobes lean to the text when they seek someone as saying that they have the authority to justify why that isn't in line with Islamic doctrine, I'm not actually sure that there is room for outsiders to believe a lead cleric that says they don't want to hew to the text. So I think opening government has pinned themselves the idea that this is going to be quite a conservative individual, or at least quite a literalist individual, that if they are going to be credible to outsiders, that I'm not sure is the most important thing. Finally, they tell you that this is going to be a spokesperson and an advocate who can say drone strikes are bad, who can say anti-Islamic policy is bad. Look, that's contingent on outsiders agreeing with this person's clerical interpretation. It does absolutely nothing to help the religion in anything that it might internally care about. We're going to get into that in constructive. So why is interpretive variation valuable? Look, the spread of Islam was not uniform across the world, and in many locations, it became quite a syncretically practiced thing that bound itself up in local traditions that people already found valuable outside and absent religion. I don't think that that is something to disavow. I think it's something that makes it pluralistic and relevant to people who might otherwise feel alienated from something central, sure, but that central point is going to be far away from quite a lot of the practitioners who are geographically isolated from the person who claims to have the most authority. To the extent that that's the case, I think that this poses 2 problems. One, we've already discussed the way this authority is likely to be conservative, but an additional constructive as to why this is the case is it's simply easier for you to provide uniformity to the followers of your religion, as well as a cohesive uniform painting for outsiders when you say, this is what the text says, and as a result, I follow it. I think that means this person's likely to try and justify themselves as a literalist, even if that isn't the direction the religion has itself taken. It's therefore hard to reconcile faith and modernizing if you are less quote-unquote religious than this cleric says they are. So I think it invalidates the syncretic practice that many people have come to find valuable in their own traditions in their respective geographic locations. Second problem that that this poses, and the second reason I'll take you after this point as to why interpretive variation is valuable, I actually think that this just means that when you as a practitioner of Islam decide to change your individual doctrinal views, it doesn't mean that you have to leave the religion anymore. So note that in order to be a Catholic, I must uphold the idea that the Pope is divinely appointed, that the way he claims to derive his authority is true. And that means I cannot be a Catholic if I don't abide by those principles. I can be a Christian, sure, but only because other sects of Christianity said they didn't need a pope to be Christian, right? This necessarily means that you'll have to either abhor or set yourself apart from that central authority. That means a lot of internal tension unless there isn't one for you to frame yourself in opposition to. Secondly, though, I think that interpretive variation for individuals is a good point of personal searching, right? So when you tell your incredibly stuck in her ways mother, Mom, I'm just not sure that opposition to birth control really matters to my religious practice as a Catholic, I think that it's much easier for you to tell her you didn't disavow everything she ever taught you when you can point to another also Christian faith or another also Catholic sect that abides by everything except that one principle that you choose to question. It's important that individuals be allowed to make that choice. Sure.
You assume that your imams and your leaders are the reformers and moderates that allow you to make the criticisms that you want. If the cultural and societal norms that govern that country don't allow for that, wouldn't you want someone outside that circumstance and context to be able to criticize that religion?
Okay, so a couple of reasons why I actually think that that's fallacious. One is that if you're dependent on outsiders to reform your religion, the West, in its opposition to Islamophobia and Islamist terrorism, has shown quite a number of places where it was willing to fund alternative viewpoints. So if you depend on outsiders, there are other ones willing to do it. But secondarily, and more important, inasmuch as reform is not coming from an imam or a clerical authority, it's coming from a community that imam is respondent to, and I just think that more local authorities are more likely to derive reformist views than a central authority who's far away from the reformist views and simply takes longer to get in touch with them or to care about them or to think those views are representative of the community they are a leader of. So why is defining through conflict important? Look, internally to this religion, remaining relevant, being able to proselytize, and considering itself the messenger of good news that it always has, it has to be able to internally contest its doctrine. A person whose authority derives from being the sole person that knows what the truth really is necessarily has to shut out and define away success from challenging their viewpoint. I think that just means that the person in charge is automatically more resistant to change. We're very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker. And I now call on the Deputy Prime Minister. So I didn't get to use two things. I'd like to thank the Speaker for their speech, and I now call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
I just came up with that in your speech. I thought it was so nice.
No, fine. Okay, fine.
Honourable Speaker, I think the reason why opening government has been complaining a lot about the fact that it's really hard to model this debate is because the question of where divine command comes from in all religions is massively loaded. We understand that this isn't from necessarily this point onward. You are saying this is how the religion's set up. You would prefer a world in which that exists. We're saying that world is one in which you shut out a massive group of people that don't believe that divine command has come from the place you did. You can't write a new section like of the Quran. Like, it has to be some interpretation of that book or that text or something you're able to appeal to that you have to necessarily base that particular opinion on. That necessarily shuts individuals out, and I would prefer that individuals are able to determine on their own. I'm going to do some refutation of what we hear from opening government, and then I'm going to get into what they said in response to Lex and add some more constructive contributions in that period of time. So first of all, let's talk about reducing Islamic extremism, and this is distinct from wars, which I'll deal with in a minute. First of all, the reason why he says that there is massive degrees of Islamic extremism is because there's no generalizable, recognized authority that's able to disavow that. First of all, I think Lex is quite right to assume that those individuals necessarily get the kind of credit from the international community that they necessarily deserve. So there are a ton of Christian terrorists as well who believe that they are interpreting the Holy Book in the way that is most important to them, or Catholic terrorists as well. I think that those people who are predisposed to violent hatred are usually predisposed as a form of disenfranchisement, which doesn't go away at the point at which there's a person that says perhaps that's wrong. That feeling's still there. Their tie to the Holy Book as being their justification still ends up being there. I don't believe that there's a massive difference in terms of whether or not they appeal to it or the extent to which that happens, especially since divine command isn't something that is empirically testable when you have two competing claims of individuals who determine them in a different way. But second of all, what they end up saying is that it stops Islamophobia, so that individuals are more likely to be tolerant at the point at which they realize that the religion of Islam is more moderate than they perhaps dealt with before. First of all, Islamophobia is not just as a result of extremist action. It's because they do not understand or agree with things that they think are important to the tenets of Islam, things that we actually think would perhaps be part of what that particular individual says is okay. So perhaps different treatment of women actually does end up coming into play with this person saying what is important for that particular religion. And that's something that also happens in Catholicism as well, which we don't think necessarily has to be, or which we think is bad to give divine command toward, that stops people from being able to actually go towards it. We think that those individuals are still able to pick up on things that scare them, things that are different to them, that are likely to exist when that individual exists. And similarly, when they see individuals behaving in different ways, it's unclear why people who are predisposed to Islamophobia are more likely to believe that individual when both are claiming something that they don't fully understand themselves. No thanks. Lastly, what they then say, or lastly in the first speech, what they say is that the individuals that they're necessarily going to get, or sorry, this was from a POI, aren't necessarily going to be reformists. So perhaps you're not getting the individuals who do want to change or who do want to modernize in Islam in the way that Lex and I tell you. First of all, we think that there are a massive group of people who do interpret the way that they practice their religion differently from, let's say, a local imam, or local imams also differ. Like, I think it's just untrue that there is a massive stop to the free thought of people who practice Islam. I know that there is free thought in a lot of different religions, one that I think ends up happening more so when you don't have a central authority. But second of all, if the claim is that they are not reformists, or that they are, those imams themselves are clamping down on reformism, the way that you say that this person is being determined is an aggregate of all those imams, or all those people that you say have authority over them. So it's unclear why you guys in any way get the kind kind of benefit of having this end up happening. So it's a question of likelihood, whether or not you think it is more likely for an individual to be able to question the religion and mold the religion to fit their personal salvation when there is a divine authority or somebody claiming to be a divine authority that has more power, more political capital, and a greater ability to say things on the global stage, or when there is an individual who is able to determine it on their own. No. But then what do they say in the second speech? This is mostly about how religion has been captured by the state and that they take a massive amount of arms such that they are going to lead to wars that end up happening regardless of religion. First of all, I do think that every war ever that has been about religion has been about something else. So it's been about wanting to increase the influence that you have in a particular region. It's been about massive disenfranchisement just generally. It's been in terms of a lack of wealth or a lack of capital. I do not think that you can point to a reason why religion is distinct. The reason that they do say it is distinct is because people are more likely to follow it. So maybe you get people on board more because they believe that religion necessarily. I don't think that this is free when you have that individual person who is necessarily speaking on behalf of religion. Why? Because a lot of things that that individual necessarily says could be contested depending on the way that you interpret that particular text. So perhaps you still get a country like Saudi Arabia saying, yes, we agree that this person has authority, we think they're perhaps mistaken on this particular issue. I'm just not sure why you do get the kind of things that they want, because I do believe that wars are almost always about something that is not that religion in and of itself. Back half, yeah.
So divine authority exists on both sides, whether it's your imam who are nationalized on your side or this new Islamic pope. So which do you prefer, a local imam who can actively monopolize the religious narrative on your side, or this new central pope who particularly be able to be open to active criticism from many spectrums of Muslims?
So entirely unclear why they're open to criticism, but it is better when you have a number of people claiming to come from divine authority and you yourself are able to perhaps choose or move if you decide that you change your opinion on the basis of what that religion necessarily tells you. So what's the world that Lex and I necessarily prefer? It's one where people get interpretive variation. That's because the spread of Islam is not uniform and has not been in a number of different countries. That one individual area is not able to be that sole authority. That authority is likely to be textual and conservative, that would appeal to things that individuals have moved away from or determined that is not in accordance with their particular traditions or livelihoods. It is more likely that you end up questioning it at the point at which you have somewhere else to go, or you don't necessarily believe that you are going against the divine authority because other individuals perhaps believe you more and also appeal to that necessarily. So it is the difference between being Christian and being able to move and being Catholic and feeling as though you are disavowing your entire religion if you go against the things that the Pope says, which are largely arbitrary in a lot of cases for Catholics who necessarily believe it. It's on that basis we're proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for her speech, and I will now move to the member of the government.
Free thought and the exploration of ideology is oftentimes a privilege only accessed by the most liberal and privileged of contexts. But the individuals are truly damaged by the most conservative and the contextual damages that people set when the most patriarchal, the most damaging contexts are able to grab hold of religion in your interpretive as well as diverse contexts that the opening opposition so lionized in this debate. Those are the individuals that are unable to voice out their opinions within those contexts and fundamentally criticize those religious structures. Free thought is a luxury not afforded to them. I'd like to point out first and foremost that the case of the opening opposition, broadly speaking, has been largely mitigatory or a negative case at this point in the debate, never really telling us or defending to us whether or not they could have the central accountability or the broad spectrum of individuals that could go to Saudi Arabia, for for 2 years, come back and suddenly appear to be an imam that leads their local congregation, ladies and gentlemen, and create all the radicalization that the opening government, giving you some credit, guys, in this particular debate. We think that they were largely unresponsive in this particular debate in regards to all those concerns. But surely, all the things that they said in this debate are legitimate concerns. Of course, there will be some variation and some splinter groups on the outside of the house. Of course, there will be some people claiming to be divine in comparison to the status quo. But ladies and gentlemen, this debate is a comparative as to whether or not there will be more or less in this particular circumstance. Surely you must give government the opportunity to be able to say, with a central religious body where everyone kind of opts into, ladies and gentlemen, that people are more likely to be able to form a stronger allegiance to one central body rather than splintering. We would think that if you can interpret it yourself, larger splinters would happen on the comparative on that side of the house. 3 pieces of extension we think are exceptionally important in this debate. The first thing, and so far has not been discussed in this debate, is what will the Islam that this particular religious structure manifest in this particular circumstance? Because the opening opposition simply gave you a one-liner analysis. It will be literalistic and therefore be conservative, without ever going to the nuances as to how organized structures are more likely to liberalize because of the fact that are either more democratic or more structural and accountable in nature. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about things that we've tried twice and given the opening opposition a chance to respond to, of how we avoid the trappings of circumstance most of the time, something that is the exact trap of the interpretive contextual form of Islam that the opening opposition wants in debate. We don't think that was a benefit. And lastly, the ability to consistently track progress, or the ability to consistently track backtracking of progress. Let's go on to extensions. Firstly, what will be the Islam that manifests in this particular circumstance? The first thing to point out, ladies and gentlemen, and we've pointed out this many times in POI, is that when you have an Islam that's localized in nature, it is extremely likely that you are unable to obtain criticism from outside that context. This is extremely important, considering that each interpretation of Islam is considered to be individualistic, unique, and especially exclusive to that particular context, which empowers the notion that whichever outside context criticizes you, they are illegitimate, they are heathens, and they don't have legitimacy to stand on the ground in terms of criticizing your particular religion, ladies and gentlemen. A global centralized structure at least allows for the criticism, because first and foremost, it creates a common basis and platform for discussion and critique that isn't even existent in the status quo on the comparative. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, the 21st century struggle for religions in general, and a case study will be the Catholic Church, is with a visible globalized structure, you are far more likely to, number one, be accountable, but far more likely to be accountable to things that are typical things for structural large structures. Things like losing followers for the church is something that drove the Catholic Church to liberalize and change their position on many things. Things like the Catholic Church changing their position when it comes to HIV, homosexuals, or Pope Francis, God bless his soul, no pun intended, ladies and gentlemen, is in that circumstance more likely to be able to respond to 21st century trends because of the structure that is organized and easily held accountable, because there is a sense that you are promoted, you are having followers, people that you sign up, and people in a global context are able to hold you accountable in that particular circumstance, ladies and gentlemen. Even in the worst case scenario where you have a conservative Pope and a radical Pope, ladies and gentlemen, it's not as if this hasn't happened within the Catholic Church, but the difference is a struggle for the heart and soul for the church becomes a lot easier to be able to focus all your criticism towards, as opposed to disparate individualized imams that you are unable to focus your attack to and ensure that you hold them accountable. Let's make this clear. It's not as if your individualized imams in your local townships don't already act like popes within their local villages already. They already believe that they are infallible. They already operate within that particular structure. Now the only thing is to allow for a more formalized structure as well as a global structure to be able to give access to the accountability that's necessary. I'll give you point.
Look, a formalized structure is not a guarantee of responsiveness. Africa is still waiting for a pope that looks like them or listens to any of their concerns.
We're willing to concede that it's going to take a long time, ladies and gentlemen, but primarily we can track the progress of the Catholic Church and consistently apply pressure to make sure that they liberalize, versus the comparative in which you have 100 different denominations and 100,000 different imams that go on to different interpretations in those particular contexts, which you are unable to ensure any sort of accountability for on the comparative on that side of the house. We're willing to bite the bullet of slower progress, but definitive and ensured consistent progress on the outside. Even in the best case scenario, ladies and gentlemen, when you are within a circumstance that you're crippled by patriarchy, things like patriarchy, war and conflict, and the creation of force of that side of the house, ladies and gentlemen, you're trapped by social mores and cultural norms that intertwine with Islam, like they say. Ladies and gentlemen, you didn't need to have Catholicism intertwined with local cultures in order for it to be popular and gain more support, ladies and gentlemen. But in order for it to be diversified like that side of the house, that necessitated the shielding of criticism, because you are able to say you're a different brand of Islam and therefore you are not legitimate. We are more able to apply criticism because other people don't live in those same circumstances, and other people are far more empowered and a far better position in comparison to the weakest of them all that live within those particular contexts. Ladies and gentlemen, the inability for you to have any sort of ideological integrity or accountability within this particular context was only created at the point at which, ladies and gentlemen, that you were unable to find a central body which everyone, irrespective of context and not relying on the weakest within this particular circumstance, to be able to levy the hardest challenge of all, challenge to God. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech, and I now move to the member of the opposition.
I wish it were true that majority of Muslims are made up of liberal, moderate Muslims who participate in debates to be able to respect the sort of opinions and freedoms that other individuals have. The unfortunate reality is that although majority of Muslims aren't terrorists and they don't believe in bombings, it is still untrue that majority of Muslims respect an individual's ability to be happy and gay, or the ability for a woman to decide to not wear the hijab. Because the average majority Muslim may not be a terrorist, but is still very much radical in the way they interpret the Quran's version of the way an individual should live their lives. So I'm still unsure why is it that in government's world, a centralized form of Islamic governance would create a more liberal world for us to live in. Two questions in my speech. Number one, why a decentralized Islam allows more room for Muslims to self-actualize, and number two, why they end up creating more extremism in Islam. Before that, several rebuttals, but most of my rebuttals are integrated, right? Because I think first off, the entire premise of government's case was that a world where Islam is decentralized probably allows room for verses to be open to interpretation, which allows extremists to hijack that and justify their extremism, right? Again, this is still contingent on your leader not being radical. OG doesn't give us any forms of incentive in telling me why these leaders are more likely to be liberal. I think CG did okay, right? Like in saying that perhaps that it's because they want to maintain their followers. I don't think that's enough, right? Because Muslims don't just like function based on math. I think a lot of the times Muslims still take into account other considerations into maintaining the sort of radical beliefs and interpretations that they have. The reason why your leader is still likely to be radical is because firstly, like I mentioned before, the sort of norms that majority of Muslims have, despite not believing in extremism, but still believing in a more radical or conservative interpretation of what the Quranic verses say. But secondly, it's usually the radicals who are super passionate and focused to go out of their way to shape the laws in Islam into deciding what should this new caliphate say, into saying what is right or what is wrong. It's not going to be the moderates, right? Because usually the moderate liberal Muslims are the ones that say, yeah, man, like, so long as you don't kill people, like, you do you, right? Like freedom for you, so long as you don't hurt other individuals. We don't go out of our way to go and moral police individuals into telling this caliphate that you should make sure that this is what you say. But the opposition is more likely to happen, whereas it is the conservative radical Islams who constantly go in to try and like penetrate this sort of structure to make sure that moral policing happens to the extent that it doesn't provide tolerance. But also, no thank you. Thirdly, history just like dictates that those who are radical usually have more funds to donate towards these institutions. It's usually your Wahhabis who end up instilling the sort of like conservative interpretations that would allow Muslims to become more extreme. So I don't think that really happens in your world, no. So first question, why a decentralized Islam allows more room for Muslims to self-actualize? Firstly, we think open interpretation allows you to reconcile with yourself even when you don't conform to conventional Islam. No. There are Muslims who do value the Quran, Sunnah, and Allah, but aren't happy with wearing the hijab or who currently are gay. When Islam isn't bound to central interpretation, they get to find Quranic verses that supports them not wearing the hijab or being gay and the fact that you shouldn't be punished and still believing that you belong in that religion and that you are Islamic. The fact that they can find affirmation in knowing that their interpretation could as well be true, given the fact that currently Islam is decentralized, the fact that we have Maliki, like Shafi'i or Hanafi schools of thought, allows individuals to say that perhaps my interpretation, despite it not being what the majority thinks, that there's still some credence because Islam in and of itself is open to interpretation, right? No, thank you. Because what CG said was, but currently, local imams already act like they are like the popes in Islam. But notice, as the average Muslim, you're like, obviously when you say, okay, the imam within my local district likes to act like he's a pope. But the fact that there are like 300 other popes out there, so perhaps he isn't infallible, therefore perhaps it's still open to interpretation, that perhaps there is still credence towards my form of interpretation, as opposed to when you are affirming the fact that it has to be based on a structured form of deciding what is right and what is wrong. That's when people feel self-rejection, self-doubt, and aren't able to forgive themselves because they believe in that religion. But why is this current caliphate saying that what I am doing is wrong and that I am bound to a life of sin? No, thank you. That's when you create less confidence and less of abilities for individuals to make progressive efforts in the name of Islam. You wouldn't have your gay mosque in Boston right now if it weren't for the fact that individuals have a decentralized understanding of what Islam is. No, thank you. You wouldn't get like your female imam leading Friday prayers in New York City, which, by the way, she graduated from IIUM, right? So I would just like to say the fact that the ability for an individual to have a decentralized form of interpretation means that you have affirmation and confidence to create these progressive efforts, but still knowing that that in and of itself is Islamic. So you don't get self-actualization, you lose out your support structure for progressive efforts, and realistically speaking, at best your new caliphate isn't for bombings, but probably is still anti-Semitic and is non-tolerant. I don't think that's something that we support. Opening. I think this is still contingent on the fact that the point at which you create a centralized Islam, that everybody will either listen or that non-radicalization or differing opinions of what Islam would look like would happen. No, thank you. I think that's highly unlikely. We think that, this leads on to my second question, why they would create a more extreme version of Islam, right? Because they say ISIS happens because Islam is decentralized. We think a more pernicious form of ISIS, if that's even possible, is more likely to happen in your world. Why? Because I think it's untrue that people will be happy and just listen to whatever this new caliphate has to say, right? Two scenarios are likely to happen in your world. Number one, either your best case scenario, whereby, oh, they are so moderate and it's a centralized religion, but given the fact that some people probably will still be unhappy, because it's the same like how, like, not all Catholics believe that like the Pope is infallible, right? Clearly they still have questions and are critical of the Pope. So the same thing would happen in our world, which means that there will still be people who are going to say that you are not doing justice to Islam, therefore empowering the anti-establishment rhetoric, right? That's exactly how ISIS was formed, and it's more likely to happen in your world. Or secondly, even if they aren't more moderate, which is what we told you, they will still be radical, and it goes back to the same battle between Wahhabism versus versus radicalism, which still leads down to a lot of the spill effects that happen within the region, because that sort of radicalization is still based on the fact that it's an establishment that didn't do justice for Islam. You don't take that away, but in fact you take away the support structures that Muslims ever had to be progressive. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for her speech, and I now call on the government whip.
I think something we must recognize in this debate is that it's a huge misconception that moderate Muslims are not as active or as vocal about their views as others. The problem with that is that the problem under status quo is that moderate Muslims are really geographically disconnected from most radical Muslims. That really means that the messages don't transfer across. They get apathetic about the fact that those messages don't translate across regional borders, because there's no centralized way in which you have discourse, no centralized way in which the different spectrums of Muslims are able to come together and talk about all those various and different issues. We think a central government with a central authority precisely allow for that to happen. Because we understand, while that, we agree that there will be a divine conception of how this central authority will look like, but we don't think, like any government, like any authority, there'll be no criticism towards them at all. We think the manner in which that criticism will work will depend upon the various different spectrums of Muslim that exist. But under status quo, the moderate Muslims are right now criticizing left and right various different radical interpretations of Muslims, not looking at one center interpretation of Muslims. This is highly ineffective, because you're criticizing one sect of Muslims. They might or might not want to listen to you, as opposed to criticizing a central authority and their interpretations of it that actually sparks discourse. The true question is not whether or not you're immediately able to change that central governing authority, but whether or not you have a structure that allows for you to continue that discussion, to continuously create a moderate set of Muslims that know where to target most of their efforts to when it comes to discourse. But we think that side closing opposition particularly is not comparative to the localized nature of all of this imam. But let's just get this out of the way first. We understand that there are liberal imams and really, really wonderful imams that promote like homosexuality and so on. But that is a challenge to exist under status quo to begin with. It's not that easy to be a gay Muslim even under status quo. What we mean is that those liberal interpretation of Muslim will exist either way, given that they exist to challenge status quo to begin with. So we don't think they will disappear under our side, but rather they also move towards center of the discussion, given how niche they are and given how unique and special they are as well. Then becoming the center of discussion means they won't only be leading a congregation somewhere in New York, but will also be a point of discussion and a rallying point for all the other homosexuals across the Muslim world who feel and identify with them. We think that's only more important when the central authority creates a position on how they feel about the imam. Whether it's a negative or positive feeling about how they feel about that homosexual imam doesn't completely matter as to whether or not they discuss that homosexual imam to have real impacts on people who identify with being a homosexual Muslim to begin with. I think that's really important in this debate. But let's talk about the localized nature that they really didn't want to talk about, because they're extremely selective in choosing a very, very small and minute minute example of the moments in which those liberal churches and liberal imams exist. They literally could point to one or two examples. The most radical and horrible natures in which this exists in a localized structures empowered by existing local structures that cannot be disempowered when you don't have a higher authority to disempower them. This is very important. Why? Because local imam and muftis can pass fatwas that are not heavily scrutinized by either international media or sometimes even picked up by local media. So all these local authorities can use their own power structures to ensure that all these things don't get further discussed, but still be able to monopolize the religious narrative within that particular area. They say, oh no, you have 300 other muftis or imams around the area, people are not as persuaded. But given that there's no higher authority and you cannot pick and choose which imam is closest to you, it's likely that they still have some sway and a large amount of power. So all of these 300 muftis and imams around you, you cannot pick and choose either which one that you feel most persuaded to, given that religious dogma are largely manipulated, and all those religious dogma are things that influence you rather than you pick which, rather than very easy for you to pick which one you choose to influence you. What this means is that, given that crucially all these power structures can monopolize it and create an unchallengeable oppression, the comparison under our side is this. It's not that all these structures completely disintegrate, but they're highly, given that we are reimagining this world, probably less incentive for all these structures to exist and gain power on that basis. That means that a lot of states that gain power on Islamic legitimacy might have much less legitimacy, given the fact that there's another divine authority giving out all of these powers. Why do we largely prefer this? We prefer this because there's a far more global and accountability and global discussion surrounding that central authority. Given that we understand that extremism in Islam isn't a problem but just literal interpretation of how much Muslims are radical, it's given because of geographical differences and how those people are disconnected from a lot of more international discussions. Having a central authority that's largely internationally scrutinized, having discourse that largely center around issues that a lot of people engage with, means that they are far more accountable actors. They are also likely to pander to this, not only because they care about the amount of followers that they have, I'll take you in a second, but also because they care about their public image and so on. Go ahead.
A decentralized Islam allows a young moderate graduate of Islamic studies to release fatwa, making progression more likely. Isn't your structure more exclusive to give power of fatwas only to the privileged Wahhabis?
Look, the problem with that is your liberal mufti that issued that fatwa might not be able to gain any traction, given that it's not a focal point of discussion. You want a central authority to be able to either decide on that and ensure that all those liberal discussions are more likely discussed. That liberal discussion might be most effective in places like New York at this point in time. But if you allow a central authority to make an opinion of that, more places outside of places like New York will be affected by this, and they start the discussion everywhere else that actually needs this particular discussion, not only within echo chambers that are already liberalized. We prefer this discussion be a lot more central on our side. So from closing up government particularly, we tell you that localized structures that currently have authority, because you can pick and choose between your 300 imams and all claim divine authority, they have malicious intent and are able to manipulate power structures to gain power in that area. By having a central authority disempower that, a central authority that's much more accountable, and we think we far better promote liberal values and more moderate values under our side, given that you have a more largely international crowds, you have views from a spectrum of Muslims and all being able to contribute. I'm very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for her speech, and I now call on the opposition whip.
I feel like this motion is a bit of a reward for having to face Tel Aviv in an Israel motion. Three things I want to talk about. First, who controls the structure that exists in this new hierarchical church or whatever you want to call it. Second, and therefore, who is more likely to lead to reforms within Islam. Third, I'll talk about the violent stuff that OG kind of talks about. But fourth, I'll kind of end with my speech. We talk about even if we don't get any reforms on the closing opposition's model, why we would still win this debate. First, in terms of who controls this new structure, I think what closing government does is kind of like assume a lot of benefits, assuming that the structure in itself is able to provide a lot of counter narratives, but no engagement whatsoever to Mayor's extension as to why that structure is likely to be therefore Wahhabi in nature, right? The only thing they say, oh, moderates lobby too, but that doesn't deal with the extensions that we brought. A, that they're minority in numbers. B, that Wahhabis have more money, like that's why your Wahhabi structure is more formalized than any other Islamic structure that exists, right? Like third, right? The third is that these are people who are more likely to be inclined to forming organized religion like they do in Saudi, right? So these are people who are more likely to join clergy forces and therefore be more likely to be able to have their interpretation dominated over there. I think all of that kind of underlies all of government's analysis as to why counter-narrative can exist from within them, because we have fundamentally question them as to whether or not those structures are capable of being non-conservative and being able to provide counter-narratives to anything to begin with. Next, we think, but also I think as much as they say pressure comes from being able to liberalize and want to go and attract people, pressure also comes from responding to money, because you want to go ahead and contribute and continue the structure that exists for your state, right? So in comparison, they said, guys, reform in Islam can't happen currently. No, thank you. Reform in Islam can happen currently because local imams are monopolizing this structure. I think the beauty of Islam is that nobody monopolizes it, right? Some villages don't have hospitals but will have multiple mosques because people stand up in opposition to the local imam who said something that they don't agree with. I think that's what exists in status quo in terms of people doing that. But even if you have singular mosque in local areas, often local elders discuss whether or not they agree with the kind of interpretations that the local imam had and whether or not to elect that person out or in. Those kinds of things no longer exist when the central authority props up that particular imam, and therefore all the discourse you talk about never happens because discourse gets monopolized by the central church, and therefore all the kinds of discussion that happens on an everyday street corner by every individual who feels like Islam can be different gets taken out. And I think that's particularly important in this debate. No, thank you. Next, right? And I think this is what we said, right? Look, as much as you say local imams are monopolizing based on that, the counter is also true. It's just also therefore easier to reform in the sense, right? So all you need to do literally is get a degree in Islamic studies and you have the right to issue fatwas. That means you have the ability to start monopolizing some kinds of start getting some kinds of traction within the system, as opposed to their policy, which means that I have to try to co-opt and infiltrate the system of the church, probably the new Vatican that exists somewhere in the middle of Saudi Arabia, like get into it, like get to the top of it and then kind of like change from within. I think slow progress is not what they get. They get regress. That's what they get necessarily under their side when they have those kinds of people monopolizing the power to begin with. So I think we are the ones who have to lead to more discourse, more kinds of like different kinds of ideas and plethora of views being taken into account, right? And as much as sure, sometimes imams have some control over people, on a comparative view, those views are more challengeable on our side as opposed to theirs when those views are propped up by central government, right? So by central authority, whatever those views may be, right? At least we have plethora of views, they don't. No, thank you, and that means we have more discussion. So just quickly dealing with opening government in terms of this argument. Can you take the time? So first of all, they said, guys, extremism is more likely to happen. First of all, we think that's not true. We think extremism is more likely to happen under your side when extremism is also now coupled with an anti-establishment rhetoric of the current structures from within, and we can point to and show that like, oh, oppressive structures exist over there. We think that's when ISIS gets a lot more say, right? To a certain extent, ISIS has been getting a lot more popularity because they stand anti-Wahhabism, right? Which is weird because both are very conservative, but like, that's how it is, right? So the point at which they have an anti-establishment rhetoric means they're more able to get some form of opposition because they feel like they're the alternate heads of Islam. And the point at which the new world says that Islam should be surrounded by a head and a caliphate means that creates more legitimacy of the kinds of like extremist rhetoric that exists. No, thank you. Second, I think in terms of state actors, what opening government talks about is this, couple of things, right? A, if you are opposed to Islamic governments, that's really, really dangerous to have an Islamic central authority that is most likely to, by the way, even moderate Muslims kind of say, oh, we should have like a moderate version application of Sharia in most countries, right? That's the kind of average Muslim kind of mentality that exists currently. That means you're more likely to prop up Islamic states in different countries across the world. You're more likely to have support for Islamic states becoming from countries like Bangladesh to Malaysia, which are Muslim majority but not Islamic states currently. Those are pressures that are likely to exist. But secondly, no, thank you. But secondly, I think the second thing is, in fact, all the conflicts you talk about are more likely to happen when Iran is likely to be able to say, look, Saudi is trying to control the hierarchy of church that exists for us in Saudi Arabia. Those are kinds of things which lead to more sectarian conflicts, more divisions within those kinds of places. I'll take opening.
Your side is
the sectarian conflicts would be necessarily worse under your side when they have more tools to be able to do all of the worst things that happens. No, thank you. Finally, and this is where I move in and try to add a bit of emotive appeal. Look, even if we don't have any kinds of reforms on our system, the fact that a lot of people can give fatwas gives legitimacy to the idea and more power that I can believe that I still belong in Islam, even though the majority of Muslims feel like things I have done probably means that I should be stoned to death. Yes, people can still say the Pope is wrong, but the ability to make yourself believe that the Pope is wrong is a lot less than in Islam, where you can strongly believe that some of the liberal fatwas that come out is actually the true Islam. That meant that it doesn't matter that if they never got any reform, because that meant that the gay child living there could still believe that he belonged in Islam. That's something that never happens when even the most moderate of Islamic churches exist. Ladies and gentlemen, for people to feel included within these communities, if not for others, but for themselves, I've never been prouder to oppose.
I'd like to thank the final speaker for his speech, and can I invite everyone to give one more round of applause for an excellent final. Thank you to all the speakers for a fine debate. I now invite you to cross the floor while the judges retire to consider their verdict.
Okay, you can go. Hey guys, one more thing from the convening team before everyone leaves. One more thing from the convening team before everyone leaves. The bar have confiscated so much external alcohol that they are going to be required by their license to close at midnight tonight. But fear not, what this means is that everybody gets to go to Cindy's. I will be selling £3 Cindy's tickets upstairs on the foyer if you want to continue partying beyond 12 o'clock tonight. Okay, so meet me up here, £3 a ticket.
might still work. I need to make a quick announcement.
This one should be, I think. Wait.
Okay. Hi everyone, sorry, can I just have your attention for a short while? Hi guys, hi. Thanks. If you haven't met me, I'm Daryl. I'm the crash officer for both the IV and the Women's Open as well. If you have, thank you. If you have any crash issues to settle either tonight or for tomorrow, I will be in the chamber balcony until the union building closes. My number is on the Facebook page, so if there's anything you need to contact me for, do that via phone or anything. But that's all. Have a great night, guys. Thank you.